everybody, and welcome to another video. I'm glad you got past the clickbait title. I made that one up after. At least I didn't make up a dramatic clickbait title and then try to find any footage to support that clickbait title, like I know some documentary makers who get prestigious prizes do. Not mentioning any names. So today's video is going to cover the topic of what actually happened in Sweden during the corona pandemic. No, I'm not saying I know any ultimate truths, but this is for you outsiders who may get... Now, as many of you know, I was stranded in Belgrade when the shit hit the fan in mid-March, well, first being a tourist, then becoming an immigrant, and then an illegal immigrant for some time. And now, a year later, I'm just going back through the media and trying to relive this pandemic. Now, I know you notice this video is going to be very long, but so is the story if it is told in less of a story way and more in a sort of facts way. Short and sweet stories are told for the purpose of propaganda. Now, during spring, when Europe closed down, Sweden was one of the countries that didn't close anything down. Hardly anything changed on the surface. And a lot of governments, countries and people, started writing about this. Why are they doing this? And statistics started to grow. More and more people died, more and more people got infected, and still nothing. And this caused a lot of resentment for some reason in the world, I suppose, mostly in Europe. But most of the time, people were more concerned about their own problems rather than the problems in Sweden. Nobody really cares what somebody else is doing when they have problems of their own. But first, let's start with March 2020, when this whole ordeal hit the light. 13th of March 2020. The Public Health Authority, or in Swedish, Folkhälsomyndigheten. I will refer to this authority as Folkhälsomyndigheten. You will be as familiar with the term as Swedish people are today. Folkhälsomyndigheten is given full support from all parties and decides to restrict public events to 500 people. The Public Health Authority assesses that the spread of the virus is very high. They write, a new phase is introduced, focusing on delaying the spread as much as possible while protecting the elderly and most vulnerable. Apparently words were written and not much was done. As Swedish investigative journalism dug into the alleged so-called strategy, Swedish media could, in the autumn of 2020, reveal how the needs of health workers and the elderly were completely neglected, directly resulting in the COVID-related deaths of several people. This mostly occurred in the Stockholm municipality, a region that is to this day overrepresented in COVID statistics. Bear in mind, though, that not all healthcare companies did this. On the 13th of March, Sweden has confirmed 923 COVID cases, with 3 registered COVID-related deaths. The death toll would rise to 167 within the next 14 days. And the 14 days after this, the staggering number, 1,439 deaths. How could this be? And didn't people notice anything? How was the pandemic introduced in daily media, in papers, etc.? A suspected child molester is still standing trial in France. Bill Gates is leaving his company. Will some sports events be held at all this year because of Corona? And actually, the question regarding safety in health care has been raised. And then what? On the 30th of March, the Swedish government finally prohibited visits to elder care homes. This was to be implemented from the 1st of April. On March 30th, 280 people had died. 2 weeks later, 1,246 more people had died. April 13th, 2020, more than 900 dead. Folkhälsomyndigheten says, "We sense a decrease in COVID cases which we hope will sustain." Hope, there it is. That magical word, that wonderful magical word I hear often in Sweden. Hope, well, isn't that enough? 859 people are in intensive care, of which 20 new cases were added since the past 24 hours. A press conference is held where representatives of Folkhälsomyndigheten state it may possibly be that the trend, meaning the amount of cases, will diminish somewhat. We can state that at least it's not a remarkable increase. Swedish healthcare has almost doubled the number of intensive care units. Vice State Epidemiologist Anders Wallsten says, "Soon there will be studies of immunity and we'll know how long the state of immunity lasts. Everything will point to that we can loosen restrictions regarding the vulnerable. Thank God we've chosen a sustainable strategy by not closing down in the ways that many other countries have. That ensures that we can prevail for a longer time." The expression "thank God" is not used, it's "thank goodness" or "thank heavens." But this, ladies and gentlemen, is what Swedish people were presented with. And why look for news elsewhere when the news closer to you sounds so much better? I mean, don't listen to international media because then you would have to jinx this pink bubble that you live in. And if Vice State Epidemiologist says this, then it must be true. Mustn't it? There was a heat wave in Serbia at the end of March 2020, and people went, "Oh goody, because I have heard that the virus can't hack it when the temperature goes up." And I was one of those people who said, oh yeah, I think I've heard that too. Oh yeah, that's good, that's great. Like I said, we want to believe more than anything. Okay, so just to clarify, at this stage the virus was unknown to the degree that anyone could have made this mistake. This just turned out to be the wrong, no shame in admitting error, except they don't. They constantly repeated the mantra, "We did everything the best in the world." Sounds like Trump, doesn't it? Yeah, welcome. The way they present this is, "Thank God we chose the best strategy because we are the best." And yes, I'm talking about the average, not singular individuals. As human beings, we're all alike, whether we're Russian or Swedish. May 13th. Something starts to happen. The Department of Foreign Affairs decide to prolong the discouragement from unnecessary international travel until July 15th, 2020. Well, that's something. Ann Linde, Social Democrat, says this is due to the unsure, volatile situation in the world. Note, not the prevention from spreading corona from Sweden onto other countries or getting the virus into Sweden. Apparently this is still seen as no biggie in Sweden. It's mostly to protect Swedes from finding themselves in uncomfortable situations abroad, where it is not safe. In all fairness, she may have said or meant something else, but this is how it's being presented in Swedish media. You tell me if you read this another way. At this time, Finland has closed its borders to Sweden. No crossing over for others except people with business, family members or friends of Finnish citizens, and naturally Finnish citizens and Finnish passport holders. This border has not been closed since World War II, and this is a historical time as the relations between Sweden and Finland are very open and pretty much no ID is required between these two countries. On May 13th, DN, or Dagens Nyheter, one of the largest daily newspapers in Sweden, reports two contradicting articles. This is how the Swedes abandon public spaces during the crisis, and Swedes are more lax about keeping away from public areas and gatherings. How are you supposed to interpret that? Do you get a sense that people truly do something, but then that was stupid and we don't actually need to do anything? Because now people are out and they're fine, aren't they? Until the next coming weeks. So we know that people were out roaming about in May, and how do we know that? Because their cell phones pinged. So Telia, a giant network service provider, collects info on all people's phones, including consumer habits and political inclinations. Of course, that's another branch of the story. This info is strictly anonymous, so they say, until someone hacks it. Oh wait, that already happened. Folkhälsomyndigheten has spent its time assembling a report on who becomes affected. This, contrary to what some may believe to be research on medical risk factors, turned out to be a finger pointer at demographics, ethnicity and social income in general, and offered very little solution as to how to address the spread of the virus. In May 2020, they released this report to the public, stating that since March 13th, The people who have been the highest represented in the COVID statistics are people born in Turkey. After this, Ethiopia, Somalia, Chile, followed by Iraq. So what does this report tell the people of Sweden? Actually, what exactly does this report tell anyone? The highest death toll was found among people born in Finland, and the highest median age among the dead ones were found in Germans, Norwegians, and Polish. This was 88 years. If you can make heads or tails out of this wonderful report, good for you! Factor 1. Immigrants get working-class jobs that require or force them to work in clusters, visit the sick, and then spread the virus. Factor 2. Some of the ethnicities mentioned live in tight spaces with several people, which speeds things up. The latter was the one most people focused on, not the racial segregation problem. For some reason, Folkhälsomyndigheten chose to see the lowest common denominator tying COVID cases together to be ethnicity or geographical birthplace. Seeing as how the pandemic is global and hits all geographical locations and ethnicities all around the world, not only in Sweden, I'll let you take a moment to think about how scientific that report really is. But, cherry picking is a trendy thing here, you see. I'm not sure what the report had to offer other than giving people something else to talk about and shift focus on the topic of the responsibility of Folkhälsomyndigheten. The MSB did research on the social behavior of people. Numbers show a decrease in the increase of frequently following the news. That's a mouthful. The trust of police and elderly care in Sweden has decreased, and the trust in healthcare and Folkhälsomyndigheten has increased. So basically, the way you present cases and shift focus directly affects on how people perceive reality. Funny thing. So a little twist at the end here. If people's trust in Folkhälsomyndigheten is going up, how seriously do people take this report of theirs? And further, how do the Swedish people, or rather did the Swedish people, interpret the results of this report? By May 13th, 3,789 people had died and 28,756 cases had been confirmed altogether. Blaming the outsider is a human thing, so I'm wondering, wherever you are sitting, did talk about blaming somebody else ever occur to media in your country, and how? On June 13th, Folkhälsomyndigheten writes, at the end of May, 0.3% of people had active corona infections. By this time, it was well known elsewhere in the world that people can carry COVID and still be asymptomatic, something Folkhälsomyndigheten up until this point fails to mention. Perhaps they don't know about this yet. 0.3 sounds like a very little percentage, yes, and it's intended to. They go on stating that the previous measures in April showed that 0.9 had active corona infections. Wow! That's like so much more! I get the feeling we've defeated 60% of the corona already. 760 people were selected for this study. On the 23rd of June 2020, Folkhälsomyndigheten releases a report that states that about 80% of the Swedish population have altered their behavior during corona. 86 to 87% have kept a distance to people outside and inside. Some may have also avoided commuter traffic and places with many people. Many people is of course a subjective term. To some 100 people are many, and to some only 25 people are many. 76% of the population report they have the necessary information regarding the virus that they need. Folkhälsomyndigheten further states that less people feel worried about the situation. Swedish public health work is largely based on the tradition of voluntary action and individual responsibility. This is where we're getting a better picture of the situation. An outsider may get the picture that Sweden's model of the 60s and 70s, social welfare and strong community, is the way people live in Sweden, 60 years later. Well, it's not. Times change. We're living just as modern here as anywhere else, in the same global world where companies and corporate law sometimes even precedes human rights. So individual responsibility today equals intrusive advertisement campaigns of mid-season and summer sales around town, parks and cafes open, and happy hours. It's up to all of us individuals to reject these temptations. We're being tested of our faith, like Job. This is apparently something we can afford at this time of corona in Sweden. Here's a question for all of you YouTube watchers. Would it have been possible for you, where you are located or were located in June of 2020, to be a part of the alleged 20% of the Swedish population who did not alter their behavior during Corona.